At the company meeting, my business partner announced, "I built this empire from nothing." Everyone cheered. He forgot to mention the silent investor. I stood to go. Then my lawyer walked in with the original contracts. That's when the room went silent. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton had 400 people in it. Every single one of them was applauding Grant Holloway like he'd just cured cancer. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting prismatic light across the sea of designer suits and cocktail dresses. The company's 10th anniversary gala, and I was sitting at table 14, wedged between a junior account manager who didn't know my name and an empty chair where my wife should have been. She'd texted me an hour earlier that she wasn't feeling well, couldn't make it. I found out later she was at Grant's penthouse, but that's a different part of this story. Grant stood at the podium, his silver cufflinks catching the light, his $4,000 Tom Ford suit perfectly tailored, his smile the exact same one he'd used when he convinced me to give him everything I had 12 years ago. He raised his champagne flute, and the crowd quieted like obedient children waiting for their father to speak. 12 years ago, Grant said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, I had nothing. A dream, a laptop, and a studio apartment in Jersey City that didn't have heat half the time. Sympathetic murmurs rippled through the crowd. Poor Grant. Humble beginnings. The American dream personified. I built Axiom Technologies from the ground up. Every line of code, every client pitch, every sleepless night, it was me. Just me, believing in something when no one else would. The applause started again, building like a wave. I watched as board members nodded approvingly, as investors who'd come aboard in year 7 patted each other on the back like they'd discovered fire. My hands were shaking. Not from nerves, from 12 years of swallowed rage that was finally clawing its way up my throat. Grant continued his speech, painting himself as a visionary, a self-made titan, a man who'd pulled himself up by bootstraps so frayed they should have snapped. He mentioned everyone who'd helped along the way, his executive team, his loyal employees, his beautiful wife Diane who stood near the front table beaming like she'd married royalty. He didn't mention me. Not once. Not even a footnote in the legend of Grant Holloway. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping against the marble floor loud enough to make a few heads turn. The junior account manager next to me looked up from her phone, startled. I grabbed my jacket from the back of my chair and started walking toward the exit. 12 years. 12 years of silence, of being the ghost in the machine, of watching someone else take credit for the life I'd funded, the company I'd built alongside him in those early days when we were both hungry and desperate and stupid enough to trust each other. I was 3 steps from the door when it opened from the outside. Angela Thornton walked in, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. She was carrying a leather briefcase I recognized, the same one she'd brought to our first meeting 6 months ago, when I'd finally decided enough was enough. Behind her came 2 men in dark suits. I'd later learn their names were investigators from the FBI's white-collar crime division, but in that moment, they were just shadows trailing behind my attorney like reapers following a herald. Angela's eyes found mine across the ballroom. She nodded once, a slight dip of her chin that said everything we'd planned was about to happen. I stopped walking. Turned around, watched as Grant's smile faltered for the first time in 12 years. "Ladies and gentlemen," Angela's voice cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel. "I apologize for the interruption. My name is Angela Thornton, senior partner at Thornton, Blackwell, and Associates. I'm here on behalf of my client, Daniel Reeves, to correct some significant inaccuracies in Mr. Holloway's speech." Grant's face went pale. Actually pale, like someone had drained the blood from his body through a hidden valve. Diane's smile froze in place, a mask of confusion that would crack into terror within the next 20 minutes. The room fell silent. 400 people holding their breath, champagne flutes suspended mid-sip, as the carefully constructed narrative of Grant Holloway's life began to unravel in real time. I'd been an investment banker for 15 years when I first met Grant Holloway. It was 2012, and I was drowning. Not financially. Professionally, I was doing fine, pulling in $380,000 a year at Mercer Capital, on track for partner within 2 years. I was drowning in the existential sense, the way men in their late 30s sometimes do when they realize the life they've built looks nothing like the life they'd imagined. My father had died 6 months earlier, leaving me $2.3 million in inheritance and a letter I still have in my safe deposit box. "Danny," he wrote, "I spent 40 years working for other people's dreams. Don't make my mistake. Find something that matters and pour yourself into it." Grant found me at a tech conference in Manhattan. I was there representing Mercer, scouting for investment opportunities. He was there with a laptop, a prototype, and a pitch that was either brilliant or insane. I couldn't tell which at the time. We ended up at a bar 3 blocks from the Javits Center, and he talked for 4 hours straight about his vision for a cloud-based security platform that would revolutionize how small businesses protected their data. I'd heard 1,000 pitches by then, could spot a con artist from across the room. Grant wasn't a con artist, not exactly. He was something more dangerous, a true believer who happened to be utterly devoid of the moral framework that keeps true believers from becoming monsters. I invested $1.8 million of my inheritance that night, wrote the check on a cocktail napkin that Grant's lawyer later had framed. We shook hands and agreed to be partners, 50-50, him running operations while I provided capital and financial strategy. I quit my job at Mercer 3 months later, cashed out my retirement, took a second mortgage on my condo, and put everything into Axiom Technologies. All told, I invested $2.4 million before we even had our first paying customer. Grant invested his time, his code, and his ability to make people believe in things that didn't exist yet. In the early days, we worked out of my living room. I handled the books, the payroll for our 2 employees, the incorporation paperwork, the investor relations, the bank negotiations. Grant built the product. We were partners in every meaningful sense of the word, 2 men building something from nothing, surviving on takeout and caffeine, and the shared delusion that we were going to change the world. The first red flag came in year 2. A reporter from TechCrunch wanted to do a profile on the company. I was traveling in Chicago closing a deal with our first enterprise client when the interview happened. The article came out a week later. It mentioned Grant 17 times. It mentioned me 0 times. "She didn't ask about you," Grant said when I confronted him. His smile was apologetic. His eyes were something else entirely. "I figured you'd want to stay in the background anyway. You're not really a spotlight kind of guy." I told myself he was right. I'd never wanted fame. I wanted to build something meaningful, to honor my father's memory, to prove I could succeed outside the golden handcuffs of investment banking. If Grant wanted to be the face of the company, fine. I'd be the brain, the backbone, the silent engine that kept everything running. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was not getting everything in writing, not properly, not the way a 15-year veteran of investment banking should have known to do. Our partnership agreement was embarrassingly thin, drafted by a lawyer friend of Grant's who charged us $500 and didn't ask enough questions. It established our 50-50 ownership, but was vague on everything else: decision-making authority, exit provisions, intellectual property rights, dispute resolution. "We trust each other," Grant had said when I suggested hiring a real corporate attorney to review the documents. "Partners don't need lawyers." I believed him. That was mistake number 3. The erosion happened slowly, so gradually I didn't notice until I was already underwater. Year 3, Grant hired his college roommate as head of marketing without consulting me. Year 4, he restructured the board to give himself a controlling vote on major decisions. Year 5, he convinced me to convert my equity stake into a silent investor arrangement, arguing that having 2 visible co-founders confused our brand messaging and scared off potential acquisition targets. "You'll still own 49%, he assured me. "Nothing changes except the optics." Everything changed. Once I was officially a silent investor, Grant systematically erased me from the company's history. My name disappeared from the website, from press releases, from investor presentations. When journalists asked about Axiom's origins, Grant told the story of his studio apartment in Jersey City, his dream, his laptop, his sleepless nights. He never mentioned the $2.4 million that made all of it possible. He never mentioned the partner who'd walked away from a 6-figure salary to bet everything on a stranger with a good pitch. By year 8, even employees who'd been there from the beginning had forgotten I existed. New hires had never heard my name. I was a line item in the financial statements, nothing more. I should have fought back sooner. I know that now. But something happens when you watch your contributions being erased in slow motion. You start to question your own memory. Did I really matter that much? Maybe Grant could have done it without me. Maybe I was just a checkbook with legs, a means to an end rather than a true partner. My wife Natalie tried to tell me I was being gaslit. She used that exact word, gaslit, during an argument in year 9 when I came home from another board meeting where my existence hadn't been acknowledged. "Danny, you gave that man everything, and he's treating you like you were never there. That's abuse. That's what abusers do." She was right. I just wasn't ready to hear it. The breaking point came at a conference in Austin, 14 months before the gala. I was in the audience, anonymous as always, watching Grant deliver a keynote address to 3,000 people. He told the origin story again, the studio apartment, the dream, the bootstrap mythology that had become Axiom's founding legend. Then he said something that made my blood freeze in my veins. "I've never taken a dime of outside investment," Grant declared, his voice ringing with false humility. "Every dollar Axiom has earned, we've earned through sweat and sacrifice. That's what sets us apart. We're not beholden to investors who don't understand our vision. We're free." 3,000 people applauded. I sat in my seat, unable to move, unable to breathe. He wasn't just erasing me anymore. He was actively lying about my existence, rewriting history so thoroughly that the truth would sound insane if I tried to tell it. I left the conference that night and drove straight to my attorney's office. Angela Thornton had been my lawyer for 15 years, since my days at Mercer. She was 52 years old, a former federal prosecutor who'd built her firm into one of the most respected corporate litigation practices on the East Coast. When I told her what had been happening, she didn't look surprised. She looked furious. "Danny, this is fraud," she said, flipping through the documents I'd brought, bank statements, wire transfer records, the original partnership agreement, emails going back 12 years. "Not just breach of contract, actual fraud. He's been making material misrepresentations to investors, to the press, to potential acquisition targets. If any of them made decisions based on his claims about self-funding, that's securities fraud." I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd been so focused on the personal betrayal that I'd missed the legal dimension entirely. Angela started building a case. It took 14 months of depositions, document production, forensic accounting, and investigative work. We discovered that Grant had been shopping Axiom to private equity firms for the past 3 years, using his bootstrapping mythology as a key selling point. One firm, Blackstone Capital, had been in advanced negotiations for a $280 million acquisition before the deal fell apart over due diligence concerns. We discovered that Grant had been moving money out of Axiom into shell companies controlled by his wife Diane, slowly draining the company's reserves while maintaining the appearance of profitability. $4.2 million over 7 years, all of it traceable, all of it documented. We discovered that my wife Natalie had been having an affair with Grant for the past 2 years. Angela's investigators found hotel receipts, text messages, photographs. The night of the gala, when Natalie texted me that she wasn't feeling well, she was actually at Grant's penthouse on the Upper West Side, the same penthouse he'd bought with money that should have been company assets. I didn't tell Natalie I knew. Not yet. I had to wait for the right moment, and the gala seemed poetic. Let Grant have his night of triumph. Let him stand on that stage and take credit for everything I'd built. Let him believe he'd won. Then watch it all come crashing down. Angela walked to the front of the ballroom, her heels echoing in the sudden silence. Grant was still frozen at the podium, his champagne flute trembling slightly in his hand. 400 faces watched as she mounted the stage and opened her briefcase. "Mr. Holloway just claimed he built Axiom Technologies from nothing," Angela said, her voice carrying through the room's sound system. "He claimed he never took outside investment. He claimed every dollar was earned through sweat and sacrifice." She pulled a document from her briefcase, held it up for the crowd to see. "This is the original partnership agreement between Grant Holloway and Daniel Reeves, dated March 15, 2012. It establishes a 50-50 ownership split and documents Mr. Reeves's initial investment of $1.8 million in seed capital." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Grant's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. Angela pulled out another document. "This is a wire transfer record from April 2012, showing $800,000 moving from Daniel Reeves's personal account to Axiom Technologies' operating account. This is another transfer from June 2012, $400,000. This is a third transfer from September 2012, $200,000. In total, Mr. Reeves invested $2.4 million in Axiom Technologies before the company had a single paying customer." The murmurs grew louder. People were turning to look at me, some with recognition, others with confusion. The junior account manager who'd been sitting next to me had her hand over her mouth in shock. Grant found his voice. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered into the microphone. "Danny was a minor investor years ago. He cashed out. He has nothing to do with the company anymore." Angela smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Mr. Holloway, I have documentation proving that Mr. Reeves never cashed out his ownership stake. He was reclassified as a silent investor in 2017, but he still owns 49% of Axiom Technologies. Would you like me to show the room those documents as well?" Grant looked at his wife Diane. She was staring at Angela like a deer caught in headlights. Then he looked around the room, at the investors, the board members, the employees who'd believed every word of his carefully constructed mythology. "This is a private matter," he said, his voice losing its smooth confidence. "This isn't appropriate for a public forum. We can discuss this Monday with our attorneys." "Mr. Holloway," Angela replied, "you chose to make false statements in a public forum. It seems appropriate that the truth be revealed in the same setting." She turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 14 months, my client has worked with forensic accountants and federal investigators to document a pattern of fraud, embezzlement, and material misrepresentation that spans more than a decade." The two men who'd entered with Angela stepped forward. One of them pulled out a badge and held it up for the room to see. "Special Agent Marcus Delgado," he announced, "FBI White Collar Crime Division. Mr. Holloway, we need to speak with you regarding violations of federal securities law." The room erupted. People started shouting, standing up from their tables, pulling out phones to record what was happening. Grant's face went from pale to gray, the color of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. Diane tried to run, actually ran toward the kitchen entrance, but 2 more agents were waiting there. They stopped her gently but firmly, escorted her back toward the front of the room. Angela continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Mr. Holloway has been making material misrepresentations to potential acquirers for the past 3 years, claiming Axiom was entirely self-funded when in fact it was built on $2.4 million of my client's capital. One firm, Blackstone Capital, nearly completed a $280 million acquisition based on these false claims." She pulled out another stack of documents. "We have evidence that Mr. Holloway has embezzled $4.2 million from Axiom Technologies over the past 7 years, funneling company funds into shell corporations controlled by his wife, Diane Holloway." Diane's face crumpled. She started crying, mascara streaming down her cheeks, ruining the perfect makeup she'd worn to celebrate her husband's triumph. I didn't know about any—" "We have documents with your signature, Mrs. Holloway," Angela interrupted. "Your involvement is clearly established." Grant dropped his champagne flute. It shattered on the stage, crystal fragments scattering across the polished wood. "Danny," he called out, his eyes finding me in the crowd. "Danny, please, we can work this out. We've been partners for 12 years. We're friends." I walked toward the stage, past the tables of stunned guests, past the board members who'd rubber-stamped Grant's every decision for a decade, past the employees who'd never known my name. When I reached the front of the room, I climbed the 3 steps to the stage and stood face to face with the man who'd stolen my legacy. "Friends don't erase each other," I said. My voice was steady. I'd waited 12 years for this moment, had rehearsed it in my head 1,000 times. Friends don't lie about each other's existence. Friends don't claim sole credit for something they built together. Grant's mask was slipping further with every passing second. The charming, confident visionary was gone, replaced by something desperate and small. "I gave you everything," I continued, my voice rising. "Not just money. I gave you my expertise, my connections, my credibility in the financial community. When banks wouldn't give us a line of credit, I personally guaranteed the loans. When we almost went bankrupt in year 4, I mortgaged my home to keep us afloat. And you erased me. You stood on stages and told stories about your solo journey while I sat in the audience like a stranger." "I was going to make it right," Grant stammered. "When we sold the company, I was going to cut you in. You were going to cut me in on a company I already own 49% of?" My voice was loud enough now that the people in the back could hear without the microphone. "You were going to give me money that was already mine while you kept telling the world I never existed?" I turned to face the crowd, all those faces that had been applauding Grant's lies 5 minutes ago. "My name is Daniel Reeves. 12 years ago, I invested $2.4 million to help start this company. I gave up my career, my retirement savings, my financial security to build something I believed in. And for the past 7 years, I've watched this man take credit for everything while pretending I was never here." The room was silent again. Angela stepped forward with one final document. "There's one more thing," she said. "Mr. Holloway hasn't just been lying about the company's funding. He's been lying about his personal relationships as well." She turned to look at me, a question in her eyes. I nodded. She'd asked me earlier if I wanted this part made public. I'd said yes. Some truths need witnesses. "Our investigators discovered evidence of a personal relationship between Mr. Holloway and Mr. Reeves's wife, Natalie Reeves." Angela held up a photograph. Hotel security footage, time-stamped 8:47 p.m. from 6 months ago. Grant and Natalie entering a room at the Mandarin Oriental, his hand on her lower back, her face turned toward his, in a way that left no room for alternative explanations. This relationship has been ongoing for approximately 2 years, according to our evidence. I looked toward the back of the room, where Natalie had just walked in. She must have gotten curious, wondered why I hadn't come home, decided to show up and see what was happening at the gala she'd claimed to be too sick to attend. Our eyes met across the ballroom. She was wearing the blue dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. Her face went through a rapid sequence of emotions, confusion, recognition, terror, and finally something that might have been resignation. "Danny," she started, but I was already turning away. "Mrs. Holloway," Angela continued, addressing Diane, "were you aware of your husband's relationship with Mrs. Reeves?" Diane looked at Grant. Grant looked at the floor. Diane's face hardened into something cold and furious. "No," she said, her voice like ice. "I was not aware." The room had descended into chaos. Journalists who'd been invited to cover the gala were recording everything, their phones pointed at the stage like weapons. Board members were huddled in frantic conversation, presumably calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from the wreckage. The FBI agents had positioned themselves on either side of Grant, not restraining him yet, but making it clear he wasn't going anywhere. "Mr. Holloway," Agent Delgado said, "you need to come with us. We have questions about the discrepancies between your public statements and the company's financial records." Grant's shoulders slumped. The fight had gone out of him, drained away with the champagne and the applause and the adoration of 400 people who now knew he was a fraud. "I want a lawyer," he muttered. "Of course," Agent Delgado replied. "We'll arrange for that." They led him off the stage, past his crying wife, past the shattered champagne glass, past the podium where he'd stood moments ago claiming to have built an empire from nothing. I watched him go, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction, vindication, the sweet taste of revenge I'd been imagining for 14 months. Instead, I felt empty. 12 years of my life, $2.4 million of my money, my marriage, my trust in human nature, all of it sacrificed at the altar of someone else's ego. I'd gotten justice, but I couldn't get those years back. I couldn't unbelieve the lies I'd told myself about partnership and friendship and the basic decency of the man I'd trusted with everything. Angela put her hand on my arm. "Danny, there's going to be a lot of fallout from this. The FBI will want statements, the board will want to meet, and you'll need to decide what you want to do with your ownership stake." I nodded, not really hearing her. My eyes had found Natalie again. She was crying now, her mascara running just like Diane's, 2 women undone by the same man in the same moment. I walked off the stage and toward my wife. She flinched when I reached her, like she expected me to yell or strike or do something violent. I'd never raised my hand to anyone in my life. But I suppose she didn't really know me anymore. Maybe never had. How long did you think you could hide it? I asked quietly. I didn't mean for... She couldn't even finish the sentence. Her shoulders were shaking, tears streaming down her face. I loved you, Natalie. For 15 years, I thought you loved me too. I do love you, she whispered. Danny, I do. It happened. I didn't plan it. Grant was there when you weren't, and I was lonely, and I wasn't there because I was working. To provide for us. To build something that mattered. I stepped back from her, suddenly unable to stand the sight of her face. You knew what he was doing to me. You knew he was erasing me, taking credit for everything I'd built, and you slept with him anyway. She had no answer for that. There was no answer that could make it okay. I turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, people I didn't know murmuring sympathies I didn't want. Angela followed, her heels clicking that same steady rhythm that had heralded the end of Grant's empire. Danny, where are you going? Home, or what used to be home. I need to pack. Pack for what? I stopped at the door, turned to look at the wreckage one last time. Grant being escorted through a service entrance, Diane sobbing into a napkin, Natalie frozen where I'd left her, a statue of guilt and broken promises. The anniversary cake, untouched, bearing the words, 10 years of excellence, in silver frosting. I don't know yet, I admitted. Somewhere that isn't here. Somewhere that doesn't smell like 12 years of lies. Angela nodded like she understood, even though she probably didn't. Nobody could understand unless they'd lived it. The slow erosion of your existence, the gradual disappearance of your own name from the story of your life. I walked out of the Ritz-Carlton into the cool night air, leaving behind a company, a marriage, and a man I'd once called friend. The aftermath stretched out over months. Grant was formally charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement 6 weeks after the gala. His trial became a minor media sensation, covered by financial news outlets who couldn't resist the narrative of the self-made tech titan revealed as a fraud. The prosecution presented evidence methodically. Wire transfers, falsified statements to investors, the shell companies Diane had helped create. Grant's lawyers tried to argue that I'd been a willing participant in the silent investor arrangement, that I'd agreed to let Grant be the public face of the company. But they couldn't explain away the lies about self-funding, couldn't justify the embezzlement, couldn't make the fraud disappear just because I'd once trusted my partner. The jury deliberated for 3 days, guilty on all counts. Grant was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, served at FCY Otisville, the same facility that had housed various white-collar criminals over the years. Diane took a plea deal in exchange for testimony, got 18 months of house arrest and 5 years of probation. The company survived, barely. The board appointed an interim CEO, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who'd been Grant's chief operating officer. She reached out to me 2 weeks after the verdict, asked if I wanted to be more involved in running the business I'd helped create. I told her I'd think about it, then didn't return her calls for a month. Eventually, I agreed to join the board, but refused any operational role. I'd spent 12 years as a ghost, watching someone else run my company. The thought of actually taking the helm felt overwhelming, like being asked to captain a ship I'd only ever watched from shore. The divorce from Natalie was finalized 4 months after the gala. She got the house in Westchester. I got the condo in Manhattan that I'd mortgaged twice to keep Axiom alive in the early years. No alimony. We both agreed there was nothing left to argue about. When we signed the papers, she tried to apologize again, tried to explain the loneliness, the distance, the way Grant had seemed to see her when I was too busy building empires to notice my own wife. I didn't want to hear it. Some explanations don't make anything better. They just prolong the pain. I hope you find what you're looking for, I told her. It was the kindest thing I could manage. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and walked out of the lawyer's office. I haven't spoken to her since. The money eventually came back. Grant was ordered to pay restitution as part of his sentencing, though collecting from a man whose assets had been frozen and whose wife had filed for bankruptcy proved complicated. The $4.2 million in embezzled funds was partially recovered through the sale of the shell company's assets. My 49% ownership stake, validated by the courts and finally acknowledged by the company I'd helped create, was worth approximately $137 million when Axiom was eventually acquired by a larger tech firm 18 months after the gala. I didn't feel as wealthy as the number suggested. You can't put a price on 12 years of erasure, on the experience of watching your own legacy be stolen in slow motion while everyone applauded the thief. I gave $20 million to MIT for an entrepreneurship program focused on ethical business practices. The donation was made in my father's name, fulfilling the promise I'd made when I read his letter all those years ago. Find something that matters, he'd written. I'd found it, lost it, and found it again in a different form. The program trains young founders to build companies with integrity, to treat partners fairly, to remember that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of the people who helped you achieve it. Patricia Okonkwo called me the day the acquisition closed, asked if I wanted to make a statement for the press release. Say whatever you want, I told her. Just make sure my name is spelled correctly. She laughed, the first time we'd shared anything like humor in the months of working together. Daniel Reeves, she said. Founding partner and original investor. The man who built Axiom Technologies alongside Grant Holloway, whose contributions were unfairly erased for over a decade. I hung up the phone and sat in my empty condo, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, Grant was sitting in a federal prison cell, probably still telling himself he was the victim, that I'd betrayed him by exposing the truth. Somewhere else, Natalie was starting over, building a life that didn't include the husband she'd betrayed. And here I was, alone, but not defeated. Richer in money, but poorer in the ways that actually matter. Trust, partnership, the belief that people are fundamentally good. I'd won, by any conventional measure. The bad guy was in prison. The truth had been exposed. My name had been restored to the story it had always belonged in. But winning felt hollow when I remembered what I'd lost along the way. The phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Mr. Reeves, this is Dr. Sandra Kimura from the MIT Entrepreneurship Center. I'm calling about your donation. I sat up straighter, curious despite my exhaustion. Yes? We've selected our first cohort of fellows for the Reeves program, 20 young founders from around the world, all committed to building companies with integrity. I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak to them, share your story. I thought about saying no. I'd shared enough of my story. The gala, the trial, the endless media coverage. I'd been exposed in ways I never wanted to be. But then I thought about those 20 young founders, full of hope and ambition, probably trusting their partners the way I'd once trusted Grant. Maybe my story could help them avoid my mistakes. Maybe my pain could become someone else's protection. Yes, I said. I'll speak to them. Dr. Kimura thanked me profusely, started talking about dates and logistics. I only half listened. My mind was already composing what I wanted to say, the lessons I'd learned the hard way about trust and documentation, and the importance of getting everything in writing even when, especially when, you're working with people you consider friends. Mr. Reeves? Dr. Kimura's voice cut through my thoughts. Yes, sorry. What were you saying? I was asking if there's anything specific you want the fellows to know before your talk. Any central message you want us to emphasize. I thought about it for a long moment. The Manhattan skyline glittered outside my window, millions of lights representing millions of stories, some honest and some lies, some partnerships built to last and others destined to end in courtrooms and prison cells. Tell them that trust is a gift, I finally said. It's precious and rare and shouldn't be given lightly. But tell them also that documentation is a responsibility. You can trust someone completely and still put everything in writing. You can believe in a partnership and still protect yourself legally. Those things aren't contradictions. They're wisdom. Dr. Kimura was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's beautiful, Mr. Reeves. I'll make sure they hear it. I hung up and walked to my window, pressed my palm against the cool glass. 12 years ago, I'd shaken hands with a stranger in a bar and changed my life forever. I'd trusted without verifying, believed without documenting, invested without protecting myself. Grant had exploited that trust systematically, erased me methodically, lied about me constantly. But in the end, the truth had won. Not because truth always wins, it doesn't, but because someone had cared enough to fight for it. That someone was me. And that, I realized, was the real victory. Not the money, not the vindication, not watching Grant get led away in handcuffs. The real victory was proving to myself that I could fight back, that I wasn't just a ghost in someone else's story. I was a founder, a partner, a man who'd built something that mattered, even when the world had forgotten I existed. The MIT talk happened 3 weeks later. I stood in front of 20 young faces, all of them eager, all of them idealistic, all of them ready to trust their partners and change the world. I told them about Grant, about the gala, about the 12 years of erasure. I told them about the importance of documentation, of contracts, of protecting yourself even when it feels unnecessary. And I told them about my father's letter, about finding something that matters and pouring yourself into it. But here's what my father didn't say, I concluded. Pouring yourself into something doesn't mean losing yourself. It doesn't mean erasing your own name so someone else can shine. You can be generous and protected. You can be trusting and smart. You can build something meaningful without becoming a ghost in your own story. When I finished, the room was silent. Then one of the fellows, a young woman from Nigeria named Adaize, raised her hand. Mr. Reeves, after everything that happened, do you regret investing in Axiom? Do you wish you'd never met Grant Holloway? I thought about it. Really thought about it. Not just the reflexive answer I'd given a dozen journalists since the trial. No, I finally said. I don't regret it. Not because the outcome was good. The outcome was terrible for 12 years and only became bearable in the last 2. But because the experience taught me who I am. It taught me that I can survive betrayal, that I can fight back, that I can rebuild. I paused, looked at all those young faces. And it taught me that the truth has power, even when it seems like everyone has forgotten it. Grant stood on stages for years telling his lies, and everyone believed him. But the truth didn't disappear just because no one was speaking it. It was waiting, documented in bank records and contracts and wire transfers, patient and permanent. When the time came, the truth was still there. and the lies collapsed under its weight. Adaiz nodded slowly, like she understood something important. Maybe she did. Maybe my story had given her something she'd need someday, a warning, a roadmap, a reminder that getting everything in writing isn't paranoia, it's survival. I drove back to Manhattan that evening, the autumn sun setting over the highway in shades of orange and gold. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Okonkwo. The acquisition finalized today. Your share has been wired. $137,284,000. Thank you for everything, Daniel. I pulled over to the side of the road, sat there for a long moment staring at the number on my screen. $137 million. 12 years ago, I'd invested $2.4 million in a dream. Now I had more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, and I wasn't sure what to feel about it. Another text came through, this one from an unknown number. Turned out to be Diane Holloway of all people. Mr. Reeves, I know you have no reason to read this, but I wanted to apologize. I knew what Grant was doing to you and I said nothing. I benefited from your erasure. I helped him spend the money he stole. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just saying, I'm sorry. I read it twice, then put my phone away without responding. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the apology meant something. An acknowledgement that I'd been wronged, that my erasure hadn't been imagined. I started the car and drove the rest of the way home in silence. The Manhattan skyline appeared on the horizon, familiar and foreign at the same time. Somewhere in that forest of lights was my empty condo, my solitary life, my future that looked nothing like the past I'd imagined. But it was mine. That was the thing I kept coming back to. After 12 years of being a ghost, I finally existed again. My name was in the history books, metaphorically speaking. My contribution had been recognized. My story had been told. Grant had stood on that stage and claimed he'd built an empire from nothing. He'd forgotten to mention the silent investor. But the silent investor hadn't forgotten. And when my lawyer walked in with those original contracts, when the room fell silent, when the truth finally emerged from 12 years of burial, I learned something important about power and patience and the stubborn permanence of documented facts. The truth doesn't need applause. It doesn't need recognition. It just needs to exist, written down, filed away, waiting for the moment when someone finally asks to see the receipts. I had the receipts, and that made all the difference. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.